So, like I said, just about me in the business of buying businesses. I have a background, worked at a top tier hedge fund, did private equity where we own community banks. Been buying businesses since 2016. So we've been buying with partners for about 4 years. We were buying for ourselves. Starting in 2016, we had owned a cleaning company, and we were actually in contract for a childcare center when COVID hit, which is what really sprung owner actions. Is that we kind of shifted then because there was nothing to buy. And we actually started as more of a tech company, and we evolved into a business of helping individuals. So today we're going to focus on the deals that we've closed, the deals we walked away from, deals that fall about part in diligence. We're really going to go through the whole stage, things that have gone well, things that have gone poorly, and we're going to focus on the 10 lessons that we've learned from that. So, our lesson number one is you want to be a buyer, not a searcher. And so we see lots of different behaviors that we would call more searcher behavior than buyer behavior. And now everyone has to start out as a searcher, and searcher, it's really at the part when you're learning and you're really trying to figure out, what you're going to do and what type of business you're going to buy. Now, what's really hard about this particular industry is, everyone comes in, not really knowing exactly what they want to do. They need to learn. And so they might go out and, they're industry agnostic. They say, I can buy any type of business, it doesn't matter what it is. And, I'll just hire a manager and, I can do anything. And really, that's not true. Small business is really hard. And if you're coming into an industry that you don't know, you're going to run into a lot of problems up front. And the brokers know that and the sellers know that. So they're probably not going to let you through to even look at the business. And what can happen is when you start looking at all different kinds of businesses that are completely unrelated, is that the brokers will label you a tire kicker and then they will blacklist you. So, the natural progression is that you look at lots of different things, you try to narrow down what you want to buy, and then you go and buy, the business is a good fit for you. Now, the problem with the way that things work here is as you're going through that process of learning about different businesses and you eventually get labeled a tire kicker by the brokers and then you get blacklisted. So you never actually get to make it to that part where you're going and you're actually buying a business. So by the time you figure out what you want, you're on the naughty list with the brokers. And when you inquire about a business, they're not going to let you through. So, that's one thing that's really hard about this is you have to e- going through that learning stage without burning your capital. So, each request for information from a broker, you should think of that as capital that you're using when you do it. So if you burn through it all too early in the process, you will ruin your chances. Another searcher behavior we see is, really just looking for the perfect deal. Everything has to be perfect. And I think some of that comes from being industry agnostic. So we see um, everyone starts industry agnostic. They're looking at every type of business. And over time, they eventually narrow down their focus. And what we've found is as people get more narrow, they're more likely to actually close a deal. And there's a few reasons for that. One, when you're industry agnostic, there's so much stuff to look at. You're going to pass on a really good deal with the idea that there's something else out there. You're always going to find something wrong with it. There's no such thing as a perfect deal. If you've narrowed down your focus, you're probably more likely to realize that nothing's perfect, but this is exactly what I'm looking for, and you're more likely to transact. You also are more likely to get past the brokers and the gatekeepers. So the brokers and sellers are more likely to let you look at the business because at the end of the day, the seller is selling to the person they want to take over their business. So it's not just about the ability to write a check, it's about the ability to run the business. So each business that gets listed could have 1 or 200 people inquire on it. Only 3 to 5 people are going to get through to the seller. And there's some ways that we make sure that we're always in that 3 to 5. And some of it's a little unfair. We have an advantage of having closed so many different deals, and we own over 25 businesses ourselves. So we can always say we own a business that's similar to the one we're looking at. But the biggest part is that we can sell our operating partner and their abilities to run that business. And that really, helps get through. We can set it so that the seller is, really comfortable with that operator as who they want to take care of their customers and their employees. Because if they wanted to sell to private equity, they would. They want to sell to an individual. And that comes down to really another, you know, searcher behavior versus buyer behavior. And really, I'm going to say I did all of these when I first started. I was industry agnostic. I thought I could hire a manager. I searched under my LLC, which is our other lesson learned. So you don't want to set up a search fund and use that to manage your search. You're an individual. You're not a private equity firm. Shouldn't pretend like you are because it's hurting you to do so. In most instances, if you're looking at, say, $1 million EBITDA and up, there probably are some private equity firms that are interested. I mean, most have a $2 million minimum, but there are a lot that are dipping down to one. If a seller wanted to sell to a private equity firm or an investment firm, they would. They want to sell to an individual. And if brokers see you using an entity that doesn't have any capital behind it, you're the only employee, they know that's not a real business and they're not going to take you seriously. So searching under an entity, I know a lot of people tell you to do that, but it really will hurt you in the marketplace and really put you on the blacklist with brokers. So that's something that we see searchers do all the time. So what we find is if you want to have the best luck, becoming an actual buyer, you need to figure out how to narrow down your universe to a one or two industries that are a really good fit for you and that you can sell yourself as the best person to run that business. You need to search under your own name, use a Gmail account as long as it doesn't have, a crazy nickname or something like that that's really unprofessional. Use a professional looking Gmail account. Make sure you actually fill out the request for information from the brokers, that you have your proof of funds and your pre-qualification in place. If you do all of those things, you're going to be able to get past the brokers and move from just a searcher to a buyer. So lesson number two, and we've learned this the hard way, ultimately the most important aspect of the deal is going to be the character of the seller. So Warren Buffett says you can't make a good deal with a bad person. And this is completely true. No contract can get you out of, can save you from someone who's trying to screw you over. And I think even as a part of this quote, Buffett mentioned, a bad person loves litigation. They have fun in it. They're argumentative. And most of us, we just want to go run our business. We want to have a successful business that's taking care of our customers and our employees versus that person who loves litigation. So they're always going to win when it comes down to that. And so a couple times that we've run into this, um, we've run into it many times. Unfortunately, we have a couple times where a deal actually closed, which is the worst thing that can happen. So we bought it early on in our process. We bought a gym out in California. The seller really just showed a lot of things along the way. He was running a lot of personal expenses through uh, the financials for tax purposes. That's a big red flag, right? Someone who's willing to defraud the IRS is probably willing to defraud you. Um, he was trying to play games with the landlord, and he'd make comments. Landlords, they're just kind of screwing everybody over. It's okay, and he would try to play all these games. And we bought the business. We thought it was a great little gym. It was made about $500,000 a year. And then once we got in, we found out that about 30% of the revenue was actually from insurance fraud. So what he was doing is he was using what was called a silver sneakers program. And he would, what that program does is every time someone comes into the gym, the insurance company pays $10, and they'll do that up to 10 times per month. So if someone came into the gym and said that they, came in one time, then from then on, he just said they came 10 times per month forever. So someone might have visited once and he might book them for 100 visits. And he did this for every senior that came in. And we even asked him about it during the diligence. And he just said, well, there's a senior center right next door, which there is. And he's like, we have a really good relationship and we go and recruit people to come through. So the story made sense. From a Q of E standpoint, the money was coming in. He was paying, it ran through his taxes. Everything checked out on the financial side and his system. It showed it as, legit check-ins. And then the first day that we owned the business, he showed our operating partner how to commit the fraud. He gave him the list of names, exactly how to do it. So instantly, obviously, we're not going to continue the fraud. And that profitable gym making about 500,000 a year went to about zero, because that was really a lot of the profits. Now, we thought we could be saved by the court system, and that's a really big lesson, is that if a seller commits fraud against you, they're going to get away with it. You shouldn't expect the system to save you. You are probably going to be the one to bear the brunt of that. So what happened in that instance is we went to arbitration, which was a mistake that we've learned later, because arbitration is final as opposed to mediation, which is a more negotiated agreement. So we went to arbitration, and the arbitrator actually ruled that the um, change in business value, so effectively we're suing for the change of business value, was due to a change in business practices, which that change in business practices was no longer committing fraud. And so we actually lost, which was devastating. One of the reasons we went to arbitration is because we thought our case was so strong. We had the list that he gave us, we had him on camera doing it. We found in the system exactly how he faked it. We could lay everything out. And the arbitrator didn't really care. He said that the change in the business value was because we weren't taking in that revenue anymore. And that decision's final. And now there are some ways to appeal it, but I think our partners decided he doesn't want to. So that's an instance where just remember, the court system isn't going to protect you. We had another instance where a seller was, he was just kind of an asshole throughout the whole process. It was two sellers. It was in a trucking industry, and honestly, you run into that a lot in that industry, and that's kind of what we, put that to, is that's a lot of the personality that you get in there. I remember him cussing out, what is the, number one by volume SBA lender in the country. This individual does more volume than many of the big, large regional banks in SBA, and just cussing him out and telling him how stupid he is and that he doesn't get it. And, at that point, we really should have backed out of the deal. It's really hard. It's so hard to find a business. And then you're fighting so hard, through the post LOI and diligence phase, to just walk away because you just don't get a good feel about the seller. But what we've learned is that that's really the best thing you can do. So, in that instance, he gave us signs that, they weren't really the best person. And then, of course, we close the deal and we find out that, there's revenue, or there's expenses that are being run through a different business. So some of the maintenance expenses were underreported, and we had even talked about that with them. And they gave a direct lie to us, and they lied directly to the underwriter. We had it in writing as well about the maintenance expenses. And then also they lost a big route. Actually, they didn't lose it; they just gave it up 2 weeks before the close, after everything was done, because they didn't like the person on the other side, and it wasn't going to be their problem. So they gave up a big source of revenue. So when we came in day one, the business wasn't generating the cash flow that was expected. That one went to mediation, and we worked out a pretty good settlement, but we're still a big loss. We only recovered about 60% of what's lost. And so that's just a lesson. There's no Q of E that can save you. Q of E wouldn't have caught either of those. The legal documents, aren't going to save you. And that's really something you got to watch out for. So at the end of the day, Buffett nailed this right on the head. If you're dealing with a person that doesn't care about others, they're going to screw you over, and they're probably going to get away with it. So always measure the character of the seller that you're working with. And really, after first blush, the best indication you have is probably the quality of their financials, right? If they are running, if 100% of their profits come from ad backs of personal expenses running through that, that aren't the normal ad backs that would go into like EBITDA and SDE calculations. They're defrauding the IRS. So why would you think that someone that's so blatantly willing to defraud the IRS is going to be honest with you? So watch out for who you're buying from. So the next one is just remembering that the LOI is really more finish line or more starting line than finish line. And I remember in the early days, we used to get so excited when we got a signed LOI and we'd celebrate. And now we know that the LOI, you know, it really doesn't mean that much. And I see people all the time on like Search Funder and other sites. I finally made it. It's like, oh man, you were in for a battle that's coming up. So what we see is, really about 30 to 50% of deals that get under LOI typically don't close. And, there's lots of reasons for that. And, I think our numbers are probably, you know, understate how difficult it is because we do a lot of underwriting pre LOI. We have a CPA on our team. I'm a CFA. We've done a lot of deals. We are known for getting really difficult SBA loans done. So like we know if something's going to work, typically going through when we give an LOI. So, for us to have that high of a rate, that should be much lower than the industry, given that we do a lot more work up front. you know some of the reasons, this doesn't happen to us as much, but q of e's are a big reason. If you get a 30-40% reduction in the SDE calculation, most sellers aren't going to take a retrade for that much, and you might not want to buy it now that it makes that much less. So that's a big reason that we see deals fall apart. For others, probably the next most common, and this is the one that hits us a lot, is watching the interim financials start to fall. So, you go and you do a deal, you say the trailing 12-month SDE was 1.2 million. You sign the LOI, and then all of a sudden SDE starts to fall off a cliff. And, there's a couple things that can happen there. One is just sometimes the seller just takes their foot off the gas, and that's why now when we go under LOI, we have a call with the seller and the selling broker, if there is one, to really just say like, hey, we've really got to run through the finish line here, because if you start to really take time off and take your foot off the gas, then this deal isn't going to happen. And sometimes it's macro. So last year, 2025 was a really terrible year for closing deals. And it was really because of more of the macro environment. So what we saw in Q4 of 2024, as we were heading into the presidential election, activity, one, in the business listing market slowed to a halt, and there weren't that many businesses being listed for sale. And two, that was because in their actual businesses, they were seeing pretty large declines. And then, and that's really common. So you'll see that every presidential cycle, or if there's a major election, you'll see a general decline in activity. It really doesn't make sense. Who's president isn't going to have that much of an impact on your business. But people watch the news, and the news tells them how important the election is. This is the most important election of your lifetime and how much it matters. And that causes activity to slow. So the problem with this election cycle, though, is usually that activity picks right back up, right after the election. But this time we had the tariffs come in. So that really affected activity in the first quarter of 2025. And we really saw it in businesses that even were not really impacted by the tariffs. We just saw a general drop in activity. So in 2025, a lot of deals got hurt just because essentially you had a 6-month period of really weak earnings. And then that killed the trailing 12, and that killed a lot of deals for us. So, like, a couple examples that we had, we were buying a steel manufacturer in the South. The steel did go into some construction. It was really construction that had slowed down. So that business really saw a pretty big dip during that period, and to the point where the deal didn't work as well, and the bank didn't want to do the lending, and honestly, we probably didn't want it to work because At the time, if it's just going down, you don't really know that well, exactly what's going on. In hindsight, we've seen it. We see it in all kinds of businesses. The second half of the year, it all picked back up and they got all the business back. But at that time, it's just declining. So, we saw that deal that we worked on for a really long time fall apart because the trailing cash flow, didn't meet the what was needed for the debt service coverage ratio. We had the same thing, with a pool manufacturer. We were buying, or not manufacturer, a pool builder, and we were buying it with someone that had a great construction background. We were really excited about this deal. It was a really good company, and their sales took a dip during that period. That really hurt the value of the business. That one we were able to work out through structure. We moved some part of the sale to a a seller note that had a standby period, so it didn't count in the debt service coverage ratio. We had actually had saved that deal, despite that decline in cash flow. But then, right at the last minute, the seller, they had developed some software for the company. They spent $500,000 developing software specifically for this pool company. The original purchase agreement said that the seller was going to keep the software. We were going to run the pool company, and they just weren't allowed to sell the software within our delivery area. But they were free to go run the software company. And then, right a couple weeks before close, the seller says, "You know what? You have to buy the software. I have to get my money back that I spent. So you have to buy the software. You have to pay the 500,000 for it." And ultimately, we had to walk away from that deal because the software had no value. It had no customers. It really wasn't that good. We probably could have knocked something out on Lovable that was, equally good in 20, 30 minutes. It just really wasn't that great of software. And, that killed that deal. So that one was kind of a combination of the seller moving the goalpost right at the end, with the interim financials really delaying the deal quite a bit. Um, Another thing that happens pretty often, and this goes back to our last one about doing a deal with a bad person, is sometimes some of these sellers can show you like narcissistic tendencies early on in the process. So we've had a few deals where you could just tell up front that they were a narcissist. So they really wanted everything about them, everything about the contract, every aspect had to go 100% in their direction. And it usually shows its face when negotiating things like indemnity, especially if there's a stock sale. And they don't want any liability for anything that happened during the time that they own the business. And that's a big red flag, right? They took in the revenue, they got the profits for the time period when something might have happened. They should also have the liability. So if they did something wrong that they made money off of, that money, somebody sues them, then they should be liable for it. It's really common that they would say, no, absolutely not. I don't want any liability. That's a big sign. And so we'll see these narcissistic sellers that every single aspect of the contract has to be 100% their way. So we worked on a mental health business last year that the seller really showed us that right away. Everything had to be her way. We were actually way overpaying for it. Our partner that we were buying it with, it was just a perfect fit for her. We weren't going to find anything better. It was exactly in her field of healthcare. It was like 10 minutes from her house. So she was willing to overpay by about 20%, and she was going to put a larger down payment to make up for the fact that it wasn't going to appraise for the right value to qualify for the loan. So that seller just forcing kind of way too high of a price was a red flag too. But that was one, we spent tons of time on different calls, fighting through different aspects of the contract. Absolutely everything was a fight because everything had to be in her favor to just ridiculous terms. And then, eventually we even got pretty far through the deal. She got, a lot of things about that deal were agreed to that probably shouldn't have been. And she still backed out, right? She still found something to back out for. We had the same thing. It was a concrete construction company that we were buying. The seller, everything had to be, exactly their way. Nothing could be reasonable at all. There's for every aspect of a contract, there's kind of market terms that are down the middle. No, they wanted everything 100% their side. And usually in negotiation, if I give you something, then you have to give me something, right? There's trades. They can just be a brick wall, which is probably why they were successful at business. So on the exiting side, I see this is a highly successful characteristic, is that just the seller that doesn't care about being reasonable, doesn't care about industry norms, just wants what they want, and they're going to act like a brick wall. When you run into that person as a seller, they can be really tough. And then they're very likely to back out of the deal at some point because they don't care that you have 100 hours in it. They don't care that you spent 50 grand between legal and the quality of earnings. They don't care. They're, they're just like, you know what? Never mind. I don't want to sell. And we've seen that a few times. Just those two examples. It's those aren't the only ones, and you can see pretty early on in the negotiation if the seller is going to be that way. So that's something to really watch out for. And then, probably our craziest story. I doubt this can apply to anyone, but I want to tell it because it was one of our craziest reasons for a deal, not reaching the finish line. Since we partner with individuals that have a good fit for a business, we're buying a restoration company with someone with a construction background. Which, if you're buying restoration, you really do want to have a construction background because a lot of the money is in the reconstruction. So it's really important to have that if you're buying restoration. So we were working on a restoration company, and our partner, after a while, he kind of decided he wanted to just go start his own company instead, which was really disappointing. But my partner Katie and I built a really good relationship with the seller. He was a CPA who bought a restoration company, realized he had no desire to be in the restoration business. He wanted to go back to working 60, 80 hours at a big four accounting firm. Um, he called us, asked us if we would partner with his general manager. Now, his general manager had built up the business, knows it. We love seeing an employee take over a business, especially a general manager. That's always the best scenario. So, of course, we agreed. Now, as we learned more about this person, since they came, we met them in a different way than we typically meet people we would partner with. He had some felonies on his background. One of them was for a charge. It said deadly conduct, and that would have turned us away completely. Although, fortunately for him, his crime was committed on social media, so there was a lot of video, there was a lot of news reporting. So basically, what he did is he shot a gun at a target, and because it was in a more urban area, the neighbors got really upset, and the news covered it. The video went super viral, got millions of views. So he got charged with that. It actually helped him that there were all the news reports and the videos, because when we looked at it, we're like, oh, that's not that bad. And also, the credit manager gave him the exception for the felony, because he's like, yeah, that's really not that big of a deal. He shouldn't have gotten that charge. So we got it to go forward. And then 2 weeks before the closing, all of a sudden the banker calls me and he's like, "Hey, Mark, what happened? He just got, I see a charge for this weekend." And he had just gotten picked up. Went to go visit some friends, and apparently one of them got picked up on a drug charge. The police also took him in, didn't charge him with a crime, but then the bank said, we're out. We were also kind of the same. You can't have someone that's running a business that has a high likelihood of getting picked up and going to jail at any time. And it was a really difficult conversation with him after, letting him know about the bank and that, it wasn't going to happen. And, he's just like, well, I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it was one of those, if you're in your mid 30s and you're about to buy a $2 million business, that's really a life changing opportunity for you. You've got to figure out how to not be in the wrong places at the wrong time. So, that's a deal that's probably not going to happen to any of you, but probably one of our crazier instances where a deal died post LOI. We had another instance we were buying a golf cart dealership with someone, and the underwriter just didn't like the fact that this guy had too big of a car payment. He had a $1,500 car payment. He made a lot of money, and the underwriter is just like, I don't like that. And it was tough because that bank we were working with, they had two sets of underwriters. This was a below $2 million deal, and one and they have a different underwriter for above 2 million. Is that this was the below 2 million rejected it, and the above would have done it all day. So kind of instance where the same deal can go to a different credit manager or a different underwriter and get approved or not. And that's why we have over 30 banks that we work with on the funding side, because you only need one bank to say yes, and you never know on a given day exactly what one bank's going to do. You have a pretty good idea what the credit box is, but if your deal gets to somebody when they're having a bad day, it might get turned down. So having the roster of a lot of different banks is, what helps us a lot. And we can always help individuals, if you need help with your SBA loan, that's something we can do. We're really good at getting difficult deals done. So our lesson number four is that the off market really isn't the place that most first time buyers are going to get deals done. So typically what we find is that about 80 to 90% of our first deals with a venture with a partner are done on market. And then you can really flip it. About 80% of our bolt-on or add-on acquisitions are done off market. But for your first deal, it's probably going to be an on market, because most of the stuff off market is, they're really not as strong of businesses. If they are, they probably would have a broker that's working on it. A lot of the times they're in the non-brokered market because they don't meet the criteria that a broker is going to look at to do the listing. And that comes down to one other thing for me. I always hate the phrase off market, on market. I think it's the brokered market and the non-brokered market. There's no exchange to go buy small businesses. There's no such thing as a market. I always laugh. I see, there's so many websites that tell you that they have listing off market listings. How's that any different than BizBuy? So how is it if it's listed on BizBuy, it's on market, and if it's listed on a different .com, it's off market? We're talking brokered versus non-brokered. And I was on a panel with Eric Pacifici of SMB Law, about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, and we were talking about this, that you know for most first-time buyers, they're much better off on the brokered market. And a few reasons for that is, one, the price expectations are set. Most sellers that are off market, they haven't been told exactly what their business is worth. And business owners always inflate the value of their business. So you actually see the asking price is really high. Of course, if you search through, enough businesses, you might find somebody asking a lower price, but 9 out of 10, the price expectation is just way out of the realm, way out of the market. So the kind of myth that the prices are lower, I would say that's not true. I have this chart here from someone posted on Search Funder. They did a survey of 314 closed deals, and only about 13% of those came from cold outreach. So if you see all the people selling cold outreach programs, it's really a small percentage of the sales. You see most come from online. So, out of this 315, 61 came from BizBuy. It says 72 came from Pocket Deals. I'm going to say that's probably not true. Almost everything ends up at BizBuy. It might be also, broker might call someone in addition to listing it, but brokers are going to try to attract more buyers. I don't believe that 72% were Pocket Deals. I believe those were probably deals that were also listed on bizbuy.com, but that person just got it through contact from the broker. So they didn't get it from the website, but it was also on the website. And the same with other marketplaces. Most things that are listed on other marketplaces also end up on BizBuy. So I think it's probably underestimating the number of deals that get done on BizBuy. And I think the reason why BizBuy gets such a bad reputation is more because most people can't get past the gatekeepers, and so they have a credibility problem. Like I said, at each deal, 100 to 200 inquiries will come in for a deal, and only 3 to 5 get through. So most people find themselves in that 195 that don't get to the business, and then they say BizBuy is a bad place. And really, just what you need to do is, when you're on BizBuy, you need to sell yourself as why you're a great person to own that business. the idea that you're entitled to the information or entitled to get through, it's just really not true. You need to sell yourself. You're taking over that business. You're going to be the CEO. You need to sell both the broker and the sellers on that. So, that's where most people run into problems on the brokered market is they have more of a credibility problem than a deal flow problem. And then just really quick on the brokered market, once you get under LOI, the broker becomes your best friend. They manage the emotions of the seller, they manage the process. Deals are just so much more likely to fall apart in the non-brokered market. So having that person that the seller feels like is on their side, kind of helping you get through the process, is such a big help for your first acquisition. And then once you own a business, deals tend to come to you. So that's where you'll have a lot more, non-brokered deals. And they're usually businesses that wouldn't work as a standalone business, but they can fit into your existing business. Now, no, this doesn't mean your only aspect you should be working on is, biz buy. Should be doing other things as well. Really, working your personal network. And I'd say the biggest thing is going to places where older business owners hang out. So we always suggest people to go to their local Rotary. You get a disproportionate amount of business owners, and the average age is pretty close to retirement age in Rotary. Some places like Chamber of Commerce, that tends to be younger people who work for companies. We don't see as much benefit there. It's going to depend. It's going to vary from city to city, but Rotary is really a good place to go meet people. Lesson number five, you know, the numbers aren't everything. So obviously, for a deal to do a deal, the DSCR needs to work. The deal needs to pencil. That's a given. If it doesn't, you shouldn't do it, and the bank's not going to do the deal. But there's really, more things to look at. So, we do have a criteria that we use. It's called the Fleming Deal Score. It's available for free on our website. It's dealscore.owneractions.com. Or if you just go to our owneractions.com, you can find a link there. So it's free to use. And, we look at businesses on 10 different criteria. The most important is going to be the buyer fit. So this gets 3 times the weight of other aspects. And that's just our view that in the small business space, the success of the business is just really dependent on who's operating the business. So, we own a restaurant, we own a few restaurants that are killing it, and they have amazing restaurant operators. We have an HVAC company that's killing it. We have a great guy with a great HVAC background. If we switch the two, the restaurants would fail and the HVAC would fail. And so having the right person in the right business is by far the most important thing. And so, that's one thing that we put in. So we define, how to score in each criteria. So, a 5 would be someone who has, several years of direct industry experience managing people. A 0 would be someone who's never managed people and never worked in that industry. So that's going to be our most important criteria to look at, beyond the financial model. The next is the organizational structure, right? If you have a company with a GM, a CFO, and great layers of management, it can be a little bit more forgiving to someone who doesn't have that industry experience, and so a little more resilient. So the organizational structure is important. Seasonality. Almost all small businesses are seasonal, so it's really difficult to manage that cash flow throughout the year. So you want to take that into account. Of course, customer concentrations are important. EBITDA margin. The smaller your margin, the closer you are to zero. So your EBITDA margin can be really important. Longevity. How long has the business been in place? Has it been through several recessions? How strong is the brand, right? A business that's only been around 2 years probably doesn't have that strong of a brand, relative to one that's been around 50. Valuation, that's only one aspect of this. It comes into play. If you can look at, if something, and typically what you're going to find is that a business isn't going to have, really strong criteria for everything other than valuation and look attractive on valuation. A business that looks really good on all these other factors is going to have a higher valuation. You can have kind of a crappy business that's going to have a low valuation. It's just trying to figure out how that fits into, the entire business. Of course, cyclicality is important. I think people really underestimate the cash conversion cycle. And a really important aspect of the business is when money goes in and money goes out. So tracking that cash conversion cycle and the working capital need, I think that's something that most people miss. It's super important, and of course the stability. So we're just looking, the green one here. In the deal score, you can compare multiple deals. We're just looking at one we actually bought. So I just wanted, and we had the name in it, so I hit it. But that's something that we actually bought, and we've owned it for about a year, and it's been a tremendously successful venture. The blue is a deal that we passed on. That really, there weren't really any great characteristics of this. There weren't anything. I'd say anything. A three is a neutral. Anything above a three is a positive. Anything below the three is a negative. Um, the only thing that was good about it is it's been around a long time, and it was cheap. But it was obviously cheap for a reason, because it had a lot of other really bad characteristics. So you can run your deals through this. Again, it's free, and track and compare different things that you're looking at. But yes, things need to model out. There needs to be cash flow, but remember that's not all of it. And we've got another Buffett quote here is that, cheap is expensive. And quote this all the time. It's better to buy a wonderful company at a fair price than a fair company at a wonderful price. And I think that really shows in that deal score, right? The valuation is only one aspect of that. And having a cheap value can't offset having, lots of other bad characteristics. And, so if you buy a business, at, say 1.5 times, but there's no organizational structure, there's no, the cash conversion cycle is really weak. They do work and get paid 60 days later. It's really cyclical. You're going to find yourself in trouble really quickly if you buy that business. Versus, if you can find something that does have that full organizational structure, they're getting paid before they have to do the work. It's a great fit for you. Even if you're paying top, high valuation, if it's scored terribly on our deal score for valuation, but all the other pieces are really good, that's going to be a deal that's going to go much smoother for you. And you're going to end up making far more money than what your models say, right? So your financial model for the business that you bought at 1.5 or 2 times, it's going to look fantastic. You're going to have a great DSCR. Your model is just going to show linear growth in revenue, when really what you're more likely to see is just a dramatic decline in cash flow post acquisition. And your cheap deal is going to become an expensive deal very fast, versus looking at a quality company that, going in when you're underwriting it, it might look a little tighter on the DSCR, might look like you're taking home a little bit less money, but you're going to end up making more over time. And I think, this comes down to Buffett, and really I'll go back to, other people on social media. I'll see people talk about all the time, oh, I bought this for 1.5, 2 times, and you can too. Like those deals probably ended up being absolute disasters. So always watch out for that. And when Buffett, he gets known as a value investor, and Benjamin Graham and picking cigar butts up off the streets was kind of the old analogy in the old Benjamin Graham textbooks. Warren didn't really start to see his career take off and really become more of a legendary investor until he teamed up with Charlie Munger, who really taught him to, not just look to buy the cheapest thing, to look for, quality, looking for brands that are lasting, something that has some staying power. So even Buffett, who people call like a deep value, that actually isn't what he does, and that isn't how he's made his money. And you should probably, obviously he's done really well, so you want to be like him. Number seven, there's a phrase, the graveyard's full of indispensable men, and women, but the quote goes men. And there's a lot of fear about losing employees, and that transition. It is really tough, but always remember that people are replaceable. We had we've had some nightmare scenarios and deals, after we took over. Unfortunately, we had one where our head of sales passed away 2 weeks after the acquisition. The business was able to go on, the and survive that hit. Now it really hurt, but the business could keep going on. At some point, all sellers are replaceable. Everyone thinks that they are not replaceable. The question is just how long is it going to take to replace them, and how many people is it going to take to replace them? And that's the thing you want to watch out for, is the how many people. Is sometimes if the seller is doing sales, um, the financial management, and operations, right? You probably can't, it's hard for one person to step in and do all that. So, what we typically do with our partners, and we have a financial management background that anyone can plug into, is that first we take the financial management off the plate of the owner, right? So, our view is that an owner should be focused on customers and employees, not on, administration. So, um, first thing is to off put that type of stuff. So payables, receivables, collections, bookkeeping, so that you can focus on running the business. Next, you probably want to find someone that can do operations, because it's easier to hire for operations than sales. And you need to remember that the owner of the business is ultimately the chief revenue officer, and I don't think that's talked about enough. Is that the owner is responsible for that top line revenue. You can have a sales team, you can have a marketing team, but ultimately, it's always going to fall down to that person, which is so important that it's an entire other lesson. And this is, I can't emphasize enough, something that's really important to know if you're going to buy a business, and it's not talked about anywhere near enough, is that the owner of the business is the chief revenue officer. And experience, but they didn't really have that strong of sales experience. And it's really showing in the business, right? It takes a certain type of person that's willing to make those phone calls and have someone say no. It takes a certain type of person to make the follow up. So when I talk to some of our partners, and maybe they went to a trade show and they got a lot of contacts, and I ask, well, how many did you follow up with? And the answer is none. That business is not going to do well. So ultimately, the business owner needs to go in knowing they're going to do sales. And I think everyone out there considering buying a business needs to be honest with themselves, because there's a lot of people that have never done any type of sales that want to buy a business. And really, I'd say you need to go try to do some sales and really learn how to sell, learn the process of making calls, networking, how difficult it is just keeping on top of customers, um, is really important. So, that's something to keep track of, and make sure that and going in that, that you're going to be a salesperson, because we have other businesses where, um, where we've seen it do really well, right? So, we have, one of our better instances is that we bought a water well drilling company with someone who did have a sales background in that industry. So it helped double, right? So, we came in, we bought the business. He already had industry contacts, he already knew the industry, and he was willing to go out and do the things that it took to drive more sales, versus other businesses that we've seen, is businesses where someone might have had industry experience, but they're not as willing to go out and sell. They can get into trouble pretty quickly. So if you have no interest in being a salesperson or being in sales, you probably should think about doing something other than buying a business. And that's the other key criteria, is buying in an industry, is always been the deals that we've seen work the best. So it's so often that people come to us and want to, buy a business in anything but the industry they've worked in. They know what's wrong with that industry. There's that grass is always greener mentality. So we'll have someone I've worked 20 years in manufacturing. I want to buy anything but a manufacturing business. For 20 years in the restaurant industry, I want to buy anything but a restaurant. And that's just such a common thing that we see with people that want to buy businesses. And what we say is that there's such a big shift from employee to owner that you're at such an advantage to do that in an industry that you know. Because if you go into an industry you don't know, you have such a huge learning curve to learn the industry and learn how to do the job versus if you already have that experience, you only have to learn how to be an owner, right? If you have no industry experience, you have to learn how to be an owner and you have to learn the industry at the same time, and that's very difficult to do. So, one of our best deals is that water well company that we talked about, where someone who had a lot of experience and they have a lot of contacts, they know they know the drilling inside and out. And then also what's really, helped that deal skyrocket is that the additional acquisitions for an industry insider that has contacts. So, there's a great advantage there is that there's not a lot of people, younger people that have um, water drilling experience. So they really don't know how to do it. So there really isn't a new generation coming up. So he's been around for a while. So it's like every other week we have, a 70 something year old competitor calling and asking if we want to buy that business. And that's where the off market deals come. When we said, when you own a business, deals come to you. So opportunities are just constantly just flowing directly to that business because other people know him, he knows the industry versus it can be really hard, if you go into an industry where you don't have any contacts and maybe even if you go to a city that you don't have any contacts. So you're in a city you don't know anyone, you're in an industry where you don't know anyone, things don't come to you, right? You're going to have to go out and do everything. And at this, you're going to have to do all the reach out for, especially for finding customers and vendors. And at the same time, you're learning. And obviously, when you're learning, you're probably going to make some mistakes. So, the biggest cheat code, if you can do it, is, buy in an industry that you know. And then really our last thing is, yeah, just looking for a business that has longevity. So, restaurants, we own two restaurants right now, and we're under LOI for two more. And they've been fantastic. Right, restaurants have a really bad. People say that they can be really tough businesses. Banks don't like lending to them, but our restaurants are some of our best businesses. And we own HVAC, water well, we own porta potty, we own some construction, we own some manufacturing, we own uh, f- quick service food. We've got all different types of business. The restaurants do great. And the reason they do great is because the average age of our restaurant is 45 years old. It's ingrained in the community, and it's really part of that community. And one of our restaurants, the general manager, her house caught on fire, and this restaurant's so ingrained in the community that the customers went on their own and did a GoFundMe for her and raised $40,000. And this is a more rural town. That 40,000. I mean, that was a lot to the people there. Versus you look at restaurants, and maybe in more of a downtown area, they a new one goes in every 2 or 3 years, right? It's constantly cycling through, and you have areas where the customers are always going to go to the newest thing. Um, this instance, you have over 40 years. Our average is over 40 years old, right? It's shown the test of time. It's made it past that 2 to 3. That water well drilling company that's done so well. That's 100-year-old company. It's known in town. People know that when they have a problem with their water, who to call. We see pretty often people trying to sell businesses that are only 2 to 3 years old, and there's always a reason. There's some type of time bomb about to go off. There's something wrong with it, and it just doesn't really have that brand value. And the market's not sophisticated enough. Like the pricing for the 100-year-old business is about the same as the 3-year-old business. So that's something that we really would say to look for. So those are some of our biggest lessons that we've learned over the years. Let's see, how do I stop showing my screen here? There we go. So those are some of the big lessons. If you want to, talk to us directly, through Leland, you can access some of our coaching sessions there. I know there's a discount that went out to the participants here today. We're also going to be doing another live stream in August that's all Q&A. So, if you have any questions, really get those in. The Q&A, it's only going to be good if we have Qs. So, that's going to be a great opportunity to, ask specific questions that you've had, because we really just scratched the surface here. I mean, we see a lot. And what's amazing is, even though, our team, on the front end, we probably look at, 3 to 4 thousand businesses a month. We sign probably 3 to 5 NDAs a day and, model those out. And the hope is to buy one business a month. We're not quite on that pace right now. We'd like to hit about one a month. So we see a lot. But yet we always are seeing new things. Like every deal brings a new challenge and a new aspect to it. So the market out there, there's just so much, and there's so much to learn, that no matter what we do, we feel like we're still running into new things. So, but we've probably seen as much as anyone else, if not more. So if you have any questions, yeah, make sure we can talk one on one, or make sure to sign up for the Q&A in August. And I want to thank everyone for coming, and you can always check us out at owneractions.com.